Okay, imagine this for a second. You're walking down a busy city street. It's rush hour, people everywhere, and you see someone huddled in a doorway.
Mm.
They're obviously sick, maybe destitute, clearly can't take care of themselves. What's your immediate gut-level instinct?
I think for most of us, even if we don't actually stop, that instinct is, it's a pang of concern, right?
Exactly.
That little feeling that someone should help that person, or, maybe even I should help.
Right. We just take it for granted that compassion, this idea of helping the weak, the sick, the dying, we just assume it's a natural human default.
Like it's the factory settings for the human brain.
Yeah, but here's the uncomfortable question to kick us off today. What if that isn't true? What if that instinct isn't natural at all?
It's a jarring thought. We like to think we're just, hardwired to be nice. But if you look at the historical record, that assumption, it collapses pretty quickly.
And that is exactly where we're going today. We're doing a deep dive into a really fascinating piece of research. It's called How Christianity Changed the World by Sharon James.
And look, before you tune out thinking this is some kind of dry history lesson,
Right.
stick with us. We're not just talking theology here. We're unpacking a massive shift in the sort of operating system of Western civilization.
We really are. We're exploring how a specific worldview didn't just tweak how we treat the sick, but effectively invented the very systems we rely on. Hospitals, hospices, welfare.
And the mission for this deep dive is to get into what the source calls the emotional angle.
Okay.
Specifically, this philosophy of dying with dignity. We want to figure out how we went from a mindset of, say, discarding the useless to one of honoring the human.
Because, spoiler alert, the whole concept of a hospice, the idea that a dying person deserves dignity, it is way, way newer and honestly way more radical than I realized.
It is. And to understand just how radical it was, we have to strip away our modern biases. We need to go back
to the Roman Empire.
Way back.
So let's set that baseline. The source material paints a pretty stark contrast between the pagan world and the early Christian community.
Yeah, and it's not exactly flattering to some of the famous philosophers we learned about in school.
Right, we tend to put figures like Plato on a pedestal.
We do, and for good reason when it comes to logic or math. But his sociology, that's a different story.
How so?
Well, the source highlights that in the classical Greek and Roman worldview, human value was pretty much tied to utility.
Utility. So what you can do for the state.
Exactly. Plato, in his Republic, he actually argues that if a poor man could no longer work because he was sick, he should just be left to die.
Wow.
The logic was cold, but it was consistent. If you can't contribute, you're a drain on resources. Doctors were often told not to even treat the incurable. It was seen as a waste of medicine.
That is brutal. It sounds like something out of a dystopian novel. If you can't work, you're done.
It was a very pragmatic society, but to be clear, it's not that generosity didn't exist. It did, but the source makes a really key distinction. Pagan generosity was often transactional.
Transactional how? Like, I'll build this statue so everyone knows I'm a great guy.
Precisely. It was a practice called euergetism. A wealthy benefactor would give gifts to the city, baths, theaters, whatever, but they expected public honor and political support in return.
So it was all about status.
It was. You didn't waste resources on the destitute or the dying because, well, they couldn't give you anything back. They had zero political capital.
So if I give money to build a library with my name on it, that's good pagan charity. But if I give it to a dying beggar in an alley...
That's just a waste of gold. Yeah, in the Roman view, it was foolish. Weak.
Okay, so into this world of utility and transactional giving, this new group shows up, the Christians.
And they don't just tweak the script, they flip it completely upside down.
So what was the shift? Because the source calls it radical, and that seems like the right word here.
The key takeaway from the source, the big insight, is that the motivation changed. For these early Christians, the driver wasn't status or utility, it was identity. They saw the church not as a club you joined, but as a family. The theological term is the body of Christ. The idea was, if one member suffers, all suffer.
Okay, but lots of groups look after their own.
True. But crucially, this extended beyond their circle. They introduced the concept of the Imago Dei, the image of God, the idea that every single human life has intrinsic value, regardless of their utility to the state.
So you matter just because you exist, not because of what you can produce.
Right. And the impact of that shift wasn't just philosophical. You can actually measure it. The article cites data from a sociologist, Rodney Stark.
And he tracks the growth rate of Christianity, right?
Yeah, from just a few thousand people in 40 AD to about 33 million by 350 AD.
That's exponential growth. I mean, that's viral before there was an internet.
It is, and Stark argues a huge factor was how they responded to crises. When the big epidemics hit, Roman cities plagues that wiped out like a third of the population.
What happened?
The pagan priests, the wealthy elite, they often just fled. They ran for the countryside to escape infection.
Which, to be fair, makes perfect sense if your goal is self-preservation.
Totally rational. But the Christians stayed. They stayed behind to provide basic nursing food, water, washing the sick. And simple nursing like that during a plague, it can cut the mortality rate significantly.
So you have people surviving who would have died, and their loyalty shifts to the people who saved them.
Exactly. And that brings us to one of my favorite anecdotes from the reading.
Emperor Julian.
Julian the Apostate. He reigned around 361 AD.
And he was definitely not a fan of the Christians. He wanted to bring back the old pagan gods. But he has this quote where he just sounds, I don't know, almost jealous.
It's from a famous letter. He was complaining that the Galileans, his derogatory term for them, support not only their poor, but ours. He was basically shaming his own priests. Why are these people showing more love to strangers than we show to our own?
That's a mic drop moment from history, when your enemy complains that you're being too generous.
You're probably doing something right.
Okay, so let's move from the ideal to the institutions. Because the source makes a pretty bold claim that the church basically invented the hospital.
It's a fair claim. If you asked a Roman in 100 AD what a hospital was, they might point you to a military facility, a valetudinarium.
But those were just for soldiers.
Strictly for restoring soldiers to fighting capacity. Again, it's utility. If a soldier can't fight, the empire loses power.
So when do we see the switch to caring for just regular people?
It really picks up steam under Emperor Constantine in the 4th century once Christianity is legal, but it's driven by specific innovators. The source points to a man named Ephraim the Syrian.
During a plague, right?
Yeah, in Edessa around 373 AD. He started hospitals specifically for plague victims, the people everyone else was shunning.
But the really impressive one, in terms of scale, was Basil of Caesarea.
The lawyer who became a church leader, that's the one. He was from a wealthy family, but he gave away his entire inheritance to the poor.
And he didn't just hand out cash.
No, he built infrastructure. He built this huge complex just outside the city walls. It was so big they called it a new city, the Basileas.
And it wasn't just for the sick.
No, it was holistic. It had a poorhouse, a hospice for travelers, a hospital, housing for the staff. It even separated patients with contagious diseases, which was medically advanced for the time.
The source said it was basically a wonder of the world. People traveled just to see this thing.
It was, and that model spread. By the Middle Ages, you have the Benedictine monks alone being responsible for over 2,000 hospitals across Western Europe.
2,000, that's a massive infrastructure.
It is, and we have to remember there was no Department of Health, no state welfare. These monasteries were the only safety net in a world that didn't have one.
So we have the institutions. But I want to pivot back to the emotional core of this. We talked about dying with dignity. How did this worldview change the treatment of the incurable?
This is such a vital distinction, and it really gets to the heart of the emotional angle we wanted to cover. In a purely utilitarian view, an incurable patient is, well, they're a failure, a drain on resources.
Right. If the goal is fixing people, an incurable person is a broken machine you can't fix.
Exactly. But if you believe in the sanctity of life, that life itself is a gift from God, then that incurable person still has infinite value. Their worth isn't in their recovery, it's just in their existence.
And this brings us to Andrew Reed. I had never even heard of this guy, but his story is incredible. A watchmaker turned pastor in London in the 1800s.
Reed is a perfect example of this shift. He's working in a very poor part of London, and he notices this disturbing trend. The hospitals, they were discharging patients who were deemed incurable.
Kicking them out.
Yes, because they couldn't be fixed. The hospitals needed the beds for people who could recover. So these patients, people with cancer, severe disabilities, they were ending up dying on the streets or in workhouses.
And we should be clear, Victorian workhouses were horrific.
Oh, absolutely. They were punitive by design. You had to work for your keep. Families were separated. If you were dying, it was a miserable, lonely end.
Because they had no utility left.
Exactly. And Reed he refused to accept that. In 1855, he founded a home specifically for the terminally ill. It eventually became the Royal Hospital for Neurodisability.
He effectively said, even if we can't cure you, You deserve a place to be.
And he did the same thing for children with learning disabilities. At the time, they were just lumped in with lunatics in asylums. Reed founded a place to treat them with specialized care and dignity. He saw the person, not the lack of function.
That lineage.
Yeah.
It leads us right up to the modern day, doesn't it? With Cicely Saunders.
It does. Cicely Saunders is a titan in this field. She founded St. Christopher's Hospice in London in 1967. She's widely seen as the mother of the modern hospice movement.
And like Reed, her motivation was deeply Christian.
It was. It was a commitment to what we now call palliative care.
And palliative care, I think for some people that just sounds like giving up. But that's not what it is.
Not at all. Palliative care is active treatment of pain and symptoms. It is the ultimate expression of dignity over utility. It's saying your life matters until the very last breath, and you deserve to be pain-free and alert. It reclaims dying as a human process, not just a medical failure.
It reframes the whole concept. Instead of being something to hide because it's useless, it's a moment to honor.
Precisely. And you can't really talk about nursing without mentioning Florence Nightingale.
Yeah, the source mentioned she was inspired by a visit to a Lutheran center. She's such a secular icon now, the lady with the lamp.
She is, but her roots were deeply religious. She visited a place in Germany called Kaiserswerth. It was run by a pastor, Theodor Fleidner, and Nightingale saw how the deaconesses there cared for the sick. It wasn't like the chaotic nursing she saw in England. It was disciplined, respectful.
And that gave her the blueprint.
It did. It inspired her to defy her parents, who were horrified, by the way, because nursing was a low-class profession. She went to the Crimea and revolutionized everything. She professionalized it, but she kept that core of moral duty.
It's amazing how these massive systems, hospice care, modern nursing, trace back to these specific moments of conviction. But I want to shift gears a little. We've talked big names. What about the unsung heroes?
This is where you see that dying to self idea on a micro level. The story of Sarah Martin really stands out to me.
The seamstress.
An orphan seamstress from Great Yarmouth. In the early 1800s, she started visiting the local jail, the Toll House Jail.
And the description of this place, underground dungeons, rats, lice. Not exactly a fun weekend visit.
Vile conditions. But she didn't just go there to preach. She saw that the prisoners were just idle, destitute, rotting away, so she acted. She taught them to read. She organized paid work for them, sewing, making spoons so they could earn money.
She gave them agency. That's the key. She treated them like potential citizens, not just criminals.
She did. And the impact was so undeniable that the town eventually started paying her a small salary because reoffending rates dropped. She proved that rehabilitation was possible long before it was standard policy.
And then there's Thomas Jones. This guy sounds like the definition of humble.
Thomas Jones was a clergyman in a tiny hamlet, 46 houses. His stipend was about 25 times a year, just poverty wages. But he wrote these devotional books that became surprisingly popular.
And he kept the profits?
Nope. He gave all of it to charity. He built almshouses for widows. He sent money to other clergies who were even poorer than he was. The source notes he did incalculable good, but is largely forgotten.
Which I guess is kind of the point. They weren't doing it to be remembered.
It really challenges our modern assumption that safety nets just sort of evolve. That once a society gets rich enough, it naturally starts building hospices. These stories suggest you need a specific moral engine to get started.
So what does this all mean for us today? Does this legacy still hold up?
The data suggests the link is still there. The source cites a 2003 survey showing that religious people are significantly more likely to volunteer, and a UK statistic found that Christians give about 7.5 times as much of their salary to charity compared to others.
7.5 times. That is a huge gap.
It is. Now, this isn't to say non-religious people aren't generous. Of course, many are. But it suggests the community structure and the sort of mandate in religious practice are still powerful drivers.
The article also looks globally at Vietnam, which I found really surprising.
This is a fascinating case study. The source describes how missionaries in Vietnam essentially introduced public welfare orphanages, leper colonies, where those things had been rare.
But there was a detail about the alphabet.
Yes. The missionaries developed a Romanized script for the Vietnamese language called Quoc Ngu. Their goal was just theological, to make the Bible accessible.
A tool for evangelism.
Initially. But the side effect was that it replaced a much more difficult character-based script with an easy-to-learn alphabet. This democratized reading. It's what enabled their literacy rate to eventually jump to over 95%.
So mass literacy and public welfare systems spring up as a byproduct of this religious mission.
Exactly. It's a recurring theme in the source. James argues that, whether you agree with the theology or not, you can't really tell the story of the hospital or the school without it.
It makes you think about the roots of things we just treat as public rights now.
Absolutely. And that leads to what some sociologists call the cut flower thesis.
The what?
The cut flower thesis. The idea is that our modern values, human rights, dignity, universal charity, are like beautiful flowers. But we've cut them off from the roots that grew them.
And the roots were this specific worldview of the Imago Dei.
Right. And the question becomes, how long can the flower stay beautiful once it's severed from the root?
That's a vivid image.
Yeah.
It brings us right back to where we started. We moved from Plato saying, let the useless die, to the modern hospice movement.
And the bridge between those two worlds was a radical shift in values, a shift from utility to dignity, from transaction to compassion.
The source makes a really compelling case that this wasn't an accident. It was driven by people who believed caring for the weak was a divine command.
And that raises the most important question for our listeners as we wrap up.
Lay it on us.
If these institutions, hospices, universal charity grew out of a specific belief system, can they survive without it?
If the cultural roots of this compassion fade away, can the fruit survive on its own? Or does that cold logic of utility eventually creep back in?
It's not a hypothetical question. It's the ultimate stress test for modern secular morality. Can we maintain the sanctity of life without the theology that created it?
That is a heavy question to leave you with, but that's why we do this. We want to challenge the assumptions we walk around with every day.
It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening. We'll catch you on the next Deep Dive.